And now I am pleased to announce our closing speaker, Rumman Chowdhury. Rumman Chowdhury's passion lies at the intersection of artificial intelligence and humanity. She holds undergraduate degrees from MIT, a master's degree in quantitative methods of the social sciences from Columbia, and a doctorate in political science from the UC San Diego. As global lead for responsible AI at Accenture Applied Intelligence, she has worked with C-suite clients to create cutting-edge technical solutions for ethical and explainable and transparent AI. She is a TEDx speaker, a Forum's Tech contributing author, and has been named by Information Week as one of the 10 influential AI and machine learning experts to follow on Twitter. She was also named one of BBC's 100 Women for 2017 and recognized as one of the Bay Area's top 40 under 40 and honored to be inducted into the British Royal Society of the Arts. She has also been named by Forbes as one of the 5 who are shaping AI. She serves as co-chair of the RSA Citizen AI Jury and actively participates in global AI and ethics organizations. She serves on the board of AI for All, a group dedicated to drawing underrepresented groups into STEM. In her work at Accenture, she led the design of the Fairness Tool, a first-in-industry algorithmic tool to identify and mitigate bias in AI systems, and co-authored a Harvard Business Review piece on its influences and impact. Please join me in welcoming Rumman Chowdhury.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in such great company. If we could please start the slides, I'll give a bit of background about what I'm going to talk about and a little bit about myself. So you may see here that my information is slightly changed. Since writing that bio, I have left Accenture to start my own company called Parity AI. And what Parity does is provide a platform for organizations to do ethical AI model audits for your AI and machine learning systems. So next slide, please. So a little bit about myself. I think there's been like such a great introduction, and thank you so much. And in the capacity that I was at Accenture and currently in Parity, I work with a wide range of people: data science teams, C-suite, legal, compliance. I've also, just had the privilege of working with policymakers and people who are shaping the regulation around AI systems. And all of that leads me to think about what we're talking about today, which is human self-determination in the age of artificial intelligence. And I call this talk the Retrofit Human. And it's a talk intended for us to really be critical and thoughtful about how we're building technology, not just from a pure implementation standpoint, but what it means when we're designing socio-technical systems of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Next slide, please. So this person, you may not recognize his photo, but he literally saved the entire human race. His name is Stanislav Petrov, and he was in the Russian military when there was a potential threat of nuclear attack. So Stanislav's job was to monitor the systems, the technical systems that would be an early warning flag for that the US had launched missiles into Russia. And one night when he was doing his job in 1983, the alarm goes off. So what he's supposed to do is, as one of the cogs in the machine, of the technical machine that's being built, push a button, and then it would escalate to leadership, and then nuclear missiles would be launched from Russia to the US. Fortunately, Mr. Petrov exercised his human deductive reasoning and critical thinking skills and thought to himself, well, it's only flagging 1 or 2 nuclear missiles. That actually doesn't make sense if the US is trying to bomb the entire Soviet Union. Well, and also there hadn't been any escalation, between the two countries. So why would the US proactively decide to initiate what is known as mutually assured destruction, literally the decimation of most of humanity due to the use of these nuclear weapons? And fortunately, he chose not to escalate and retaliate. And he did this in violation of what the system was telling him. And thank goodness he did, because he was correct. The US had not launched nuclear missiles. And if he had not thought through critically understanding the context of the situation, the world would be a drastically different place. I would interestingly like to note that he was actually punished for violating the chain of command within the system and for taking this action. Next slide, please. So when we frame this in the world of artificial intelligence, it's very interesting how we perceive our role in a world that we see as increasingly dominated by AI and machine learning. So if you could go to slido.com and enter event X793, I would love your opinion. So first of all, do you think you're someone who has control or influence over AI systems? I'm going to wait a few minutes while the question is being answered. But again, what you do is you go to slido.com, you enter event number X793, and you answer the question yes, no, or unsure to the prompt, are you someone who has control or influence over AI? And it's really interesting. And what I would like to understand is where you feel you fit in this AI-driven future, because the way we talk about these systems is that we're going to increasingly be dominated by them. So I will take a few more seconds on this. So right now we're seeing a lot of unsures and a lot more no's. A handful of people saying yes. All right, so next slide, please. So while we rack up our input, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we talk about when we talk about artificial intelligence. So the TEDx talk I gave was called Moral Outsourcing. And the purpose of the Moral Outsourcing talk was to raise to engineers, developers, and data scientists that we are responsible for the technology that we build. And increasingly, in our language of how we talk about AI and in our imagery of how we portray artificial intelligence, we're deferring our responsibility by acting as if this thing is alive and functioning on its own and due to its own free will. So next slide, please. And these are the kinds of headlines we see. So we see things like AI is just as good at diagnosing illness as humans, implication being doctors will be replaced by AI. The solution to our education crisis might be AI. Implication, well, not implication, subheading, our educators next in line for a robot takeover, and that lawyers could be the next profession to be replaced by computers. I suppose implication being that there were previous professions replaced entirely by computers. So we see here that artificial intelligence is essentially being used as a proper noun, that then AI is now a functioning, contributing part of our society that is taking away jobs from human beings. And to visit our poll right now, we have about split 25-25 saying no or unsure, and 50% saying yes, that they do feel like there's somebody who has control or influence over AI systems. Next slide, please. So in reality, again, our imagery, our words really matter at how we portray these systems that either we are responsible for building or we are the recipient of. So what AI really is and machine learning really is on the left-hand side. This looks very familiar to lots of people. It's just code, right? And I like to say that algorithms are essentially math put into code. But what people think artificial intelligence is the thing on the right, that it's some sentient functioning robot. And for sure, like data science community, we are perpetrators of this myth as well. And interestingly, what I love about the image on the right is while everybody listening to this talk probably immediately recognized it as a really commonly used image in the artificial intelligence space, it is actually a screenshot from a Björk music video called All Is Made of Love. So what is fascinating to me, and actually rather humorous to me, is that our big technological future-shaping tech image, the one that literally everybody would recognize, is actually from a music video made by a really loopy Icelandic woman back in the 90s. So it goes to show that how much of what the perception is shapes people's thoughts, fears of what the technology is, but then also how far removed from reality that it is. Next slide, please. And this feeds into, and as I mentioned, we too are the perpetrators of this mythology. And as Dr. Meredith Broussard of NYU and the author of Artificial Unintelligence would say, this is an example of technochauvinism, the belief that technology is always the solution. What I would say for my counterparts in Silicon Valley, folks that I've worked with, this intent is not malicious. We're not trying to lie to people, but the ethos in Silicon Valley culture is often that human beings are flawed and technology is the solution. So this is quite interesting as we start to think about this concept of human-centric AI or human-in-the-loop AI, which has actually replaced this narrative of automation. So the arc we've seen in our industry has been something like, okay, first we started talking about artificial intelligence as this magical thing that's going to solve all of our problems. Well, next came the pretty inevitable backlash. What about our jobs? What about our autonomy? How do we make decisions? And now we're scrambling to say, okay, yeah, human in the loop, human-centric AI, we got this. However, again, going back to the basic ethos of, and I don't define Silicon Valley geographically, I define Silicon Valley as an ethos, as a mentality, as almost a religion. And what this religion often believes is that technology is better than the human condition. And we see it in the language when we talk about things like hacking the body or hacking a system, as in like there's a problem because we need things like sleep. There's a problem because we have things like emotions, and these things need to be regulated and managed, and technology is the best intermediary to do so. Next slide, please. And quite literally, artificial intelligence could be our savior, said the CEO of Google. And he says, I am an optimist. So what I'm also increasingly seeing is this framing of those who work in the ethics space being framed as pessimists versus the quote unquote AI optimists. And I find that really fascinating because perfectly honestly, I would not be doing this if I didn't have a strong belief in the technology. I challenge this notion and this false dichotomy to say that actually optimists are the people who want the technology to be ethical. What we want is a world in which we're not simply upholding status quo institutions, but we're utilizing technology to critically understand flaws in these systems and address them in a way that is beneficial to humanity. That is a much, much harder problem than saying, let's make X more efficient. So in a sense, I would say we're all optimists in our own way. And the folks who are working in ethics are not pointing out problems to be a wet blanket. We're pointing out issues in order to solve them and make a better system and make a better product. Next slide, please. And that's why I've coined the term retrofit human. So what we're seeing over and over and over again is if we refuse to see the limitations of technology, what we have is an adjustment of human beings and humanity to the limitations of the technological system, rather than adjustment of the technology in a way that serves humanity. And this is critically important because we're seeing it being reflected in the advanced systems that are being built today. Next slide, please. So actually back to our original poll, are you someone who has control influence over AI? We have, let's see, it's actually quite literally split down the middle. So half the people said yes, and the other half of people said no or unsure. So we do live in a world in which folks think, well, at least half of people taking this poll, which is surprising because we have an overrepresented sample of technologists here, do not feel like or not sure if they have any sort of control over AI systems. So next question. This is it's a little bit of a trick question. Should a self-driving car have a steering wheel? If you go back to Slido, you'll see I have started the new question. Feel free to answer. And I'm curious to see if this answer starts to evolve as I start presenting my slides. Next slide, please. So what is interesting about this car? So this car is one of the earlier concept cars when we first started talking about autonomous vehicles. And for most of us, I think it was probably around maybe the late 2000s, early 2010s, where people started actually talking about these things like they could be real. And we all probably shared the same vision of what we thought when someone first said, we're going to have autonomous vehicles. So we all imagined, this is great. I'm going to get in my car in the morning and I'm going to sleep or check my email while my car whisks me off to work. And for those of us who live in cities and taken public transit, essentially it would be like an evolved form of public transit that would take you from point to point rather than take you to an intermediary point and you have to go the rest of the way yourself. So it seemed to have solved all your problems. So what's really interesting about the design of this car, you'll notice, one, it has no steering wheel, and two, the seats are all facing each other. And if you look at some of the more radical, this is actually a pretty tame concept car. Some of the more radical ones essentially had TV screens all around you, because why would you want to look outside? You're not driving, the car is driving. So it became this essentially recreational pod that took you places. Next slide, please. But what the reality is that what we are being sold as autonomous vehicles is at level 2 to 3, and maybe some of them 4, for what autonomous vehicles are. And what I love about this image is we're seeing the different grades of needing a steering wheel. And why am I harping on this concept of steering wheel? You'll see it in a minute. But where we are today is we have partial, conditional, maybe in some cases high automation. And I would argue that we have high automation in cases like Waymo, where they've essentially constructed it for a very, very specific environment, or in cases in which it's a incredibly closed and controlled or pre-planned situation. But for most cases, we have partial and conditional automation. And in all of those cases, even in high automation, still need a steering wheel in a car. Still, you're asking, why does she keep harping on the steering wheel? Next slide, please. Because what we have seen is that human beings end up becoming the moral crumple zone. So Madeline Eilish coined this term, moral crumple zone, and essentially it's while the crumple zone in a car is meant to protect the human driver. So if you've noticed that cars today are built very differently from the way cars used to be built. They used to be built very quote unquote solidly. If you have somebody who is maybe older or familiar with older cars, and they'd say things like, cars today aren't built the way they were before. Like, they're not actually. They are meant to crumple. But the point is they absorb the collision, and that's why they crumple. But in doing so, the car's totals, but the human is safe. In this case, human beings have become the moral crumple zone. So we protect the integrity of the technological system at the expense of the human operator. So back to this concept of the steering wheels. So this is an example of a Tesla that crashed while on autopilot. The company's first reaction was, well, the driver was being warned by the system and they did nothing. So it's operating on autopilot, but autopilot is not our problem. It's your problem to deal with it if autopilot is problematic. And how are they able to do that? Because you still design them to look like regular cars. So you get the worst of commuting, which is constantly paying attention, hands on 10 and 2. We're not having this recreational pod, but you also get no control over what's happening unless it's an emergency situation, in which case it is your fault if something bad happens. Next slide, please. And similarly, if you remember in 2018, an Uber, quote, self-driving car crashed into hit a woman who was crossing the street. Now, investigations of the model that was built showed that it indeed did not see her because of the tuning parameters that were being used. This is not intentional, this is not malicious, and this is not a conspiracy, right? Computer vision systems are only as good as the tuning. You cannot plan for literally every situation that will happen. And this was an incredibly unfortunate situation where the individual was not picked up. But do you know who is responsible for this? Apparently, the operator. So the person who was sitting behind the wheel apparently should have been paying attention in this quote unquote autonomous self-driving vehicle. And because they were not, they are charged with negligent homicide. So what we've done is we've given up our autonomy, but we have given up none of the liability. And the way the systems are now being built is because we have this thing, the steering wheel, which gives us the pretense of control over a system. We're now responsible, and we're using human beings as the liability sponge, so that the pursuit of technology can happen above all. Next slide, please. So I had asked to go revisit the question, but folks can, let's see. So what I had in the initial one was that 93% of people thought that self-driving cars should have steering wheels, and 7% thought no. So I'm going to leave the next one up. Given that a steering wheel essentially means that we hold all the liability, do we still think a self-driving car should have a steering wheel? And to which I ask, do you really want to have an autonomous vehicle where it's your job to pay attention the whole time? For me, I personally think that it's, again, the intent or the benefit to humanity that we would gain from autonomous driving isn't necessarily realized by the systems that we are being told today are autonomous. And maybe that is in our future, but it is certainly not today. Next slide, please. So the question is, which is it? So if you remember the retrofit human, we're deciding that systems should be more built like social systems, our infrastructure, our cities should be built around enabling the technology rather than helping people. So on one end, on the right, we have Paris, and actually this week if you read CityLab had another article about the 15-minute city and how COVID, could more easily be stemmed with this concept of a 15-minute city. The idea of a 15-minute city is actually to enable mobility, human mobility, that everything you need should be within 15 minutes of where you live. Shopping, schools, anything you want, but transportation would predominantly be walking, biking, etc., then public transit. At the very bottom would be vehicles. And that's literally the opposite of what the state of Michigan is saying, which is that it wants to entirely redesign its road network to accommodate driverless cars. So again, we know that driverless cars are quite limited in how they can operate because of the unpredictability of the world. But instead of saying, well, let's think of a way to utilize this technology in a way that preserves the best for humanity, instead we're going to say, let's just reshape roads so that the cars can be better functional. So again, I think through the retrofit human, and it's problematic for those of us who work in ethics, right? The answer to this is not, let's not have autonomous vehicles. And absolutely, we should think about it. We should explore it, but we should explore it within the construct of what is best for people. What is best for people living in cities? What is best for people given the pandemic? What is the best for people given the amount of resources and money that needs to be spent to, for example, redesign an entire road network so that privately built car companies can profit off of the redesign of public infrastructure. So, when I think about retrofit human, and for those of us who work in ethics, our goal, as I mentioned, as optimists, is to see a much better world in which human beings and technology are working together to really improve the human condition. And interestingly, what I'm seeing now in our poll is that the results have completely flipped. I'm seeing 57% of people saying no, self-driving cars should not have steering wheels. Oh, kidding, 50-50. It literally mapped to 50-50 now. So we went from 93% of people saying they should have steering wheels to 50% saying that they should not have steering wheels or should. Next slide, please. So the damage is more than cars. So I'm utilizing this example of a driverless vehicle to illustrate my point. But in a large sense, like the amount of people who have autonomous vehicles, et cetera, is very, very small. Most people still drive traditional vehicles, and the damage is much more than cars, though. So we are seeing this play out in a number of systems in which we're making automated decision-making, or we're trying to automate certain parts of society that we're actually not quite prepared to yet. So next slide, please. This individual, Robert Julian Borchak Williams, was arrested in front of his wife and 2 daughters for a crime he did not commit because a faulty facial recognition match led to him being arrested. As you can tell by this picture, he is a Black man, and we know that facial recognition systems do not recognize Black people at the same rate that they recognize white people or lighter-skinned people. And yet these systems are increasingly in use to the extent that this individual was arrested without redress, by the way. He was actually kept in prison. When they realized they had the wrong guy, they just kind of let him go, and that was it. There was no system of redress for him, but because the algorithm, the facial recognition system incorrectly made a match, cops just went out and arrested him. Next slide, please. Similarly, in Pasco County, they've created a predictive policing system. So if you are familiar with predictive policing system, it is the use of predictive algorithms to determine who is likely to commit a violent crime. So mind you, it is not saying the person, it's not identifying people who have committed crimes of a particular type. It is saying that we're going to try to say who might be or who will who will commit a violent crime, and then the intervention is sort of left up to the police officers who get the information. Well, in Pasco County, they've actually been utilizing such a system since about 2014. And what this investigation found was that the 20 addresses visited most, in other words, the highest risk, highest priority people, more than half of them were quite literally children. They were children, they were middle or high schoolers who were constantly harassed at their homes, at school, at their summer jobs, at basketball camp by police officers who had actually no reason. They had not committed a crime. They had not done anything wrong. They made it onto the list because, yes, they had committed infractions that had put them on the map. However, the harassment that they were faced with, has led to serious outcry over the use of this system, especially, again, their children. Next slide, please. And in Houston, where I actually am speaking to you from, the public school system for 5 years, 2011 to 2015, where it was using automated decision-making to determine teacher evaluations, terminations, and promotions. And teachers were not actually given visibility into how this algorithm was used, and they denied employees the right to challenge their termination. But because it is an algorithm being used in a public system, the Houston teachers successfully won a lawsuit on the basis of due process. So if automated decision-making is being used in a public system like Medicare, Medicaid, public schools, we do have some rights. But also that's great, but we had to wait until people were harmed and litigated to actually change the system. What about the opportunity cost? We actually don't know how many teachers' careers were stunted or literally eliminated incorrectly by the system, which was in place for 4 years before anything happened. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Next slide. So I point you to this really great book by Stuart Selber called Multiliteracies for a Digital Age. This book was recommended to me by Chris Wiggins, who's a professor at Columbia, but also the head of data science at the New York Times. And I have just been raving about it ever since. And it's really fascinating because this book was was written in 2005, and it was about, and Stuart Selber is an English teacher. And what he's writing about is this concept of digital literacy. So we talk about how people need to get educated, everyone needs to get smart about AI. And what does that actually mean? So are we going to have lawmakers take programming classes? Do kindergarten teachers need to know Python in order to know whether or not an algorithm is discriminating against them? Well, no, would be what Dr. Selber would say, that there are different kinds of literacy. Functional literacy is what most of us have, so computers as tools. So, I use my PC or my Mac to send email. You are a user of technology. You are effectively able to communicate via a computer. But you're not necessarily knowledgeable about how to critique it to understand if the system is working well. And that's the second, is critical literacy, computers as cultural artifacts, so students as questioners of technology. How do you ask if this is the most efficient email system, or whether or not, and increasingly we're talking about things like privacy preservation. And finally, rhetorical literacy. So this would be where a lot of us are, the people who develop the technology. Computers as hypertextual media, students as producers of technology, and the objective of rhetorical literacy, particularly for producers, folks like us, is reflective praxis. So the ability to reflect on our practices, think critically about whether what we are building is solving the problems that we claim they're building, that they're solving, or whether or not we're creating a brand new set of problems. So it is up to us, according to this framework, as developers, builders, and producers, to have the adequate kind of reflection. And yes, everybody needs to get quote unquote smart about artificial intelligence and machine learning, but we all have very different roles to play. And for those of us who are the producers, we hold the most responsibility to have the reflective praxis on our whether it's our pedagogy or whether or not it's our development or the tools we're building, to really create tools that are in the best interest of humanity. Next slide, please. So how do we create human in the loop? So I started off with a bit of a scathing critique on this newfound like Silicon Valley and tech narrative of human in the loop, but it is not meant to be sarcastic or critical. Like, we actually do need to create human in the loop, but it is not as easy as we saw with the Stanislav Petrov example of just sticking a person at the end of a system, because we've not created the appropriate systems to enable this individual to make the right decisions. We could have very, very easily, in the Petrov example, ended up in a very, very different world. I actually have done some research on this. About a month ago, we published a paper. It is in Sloan Management Review. There's also a non-paywalled great write-up in ZDNet. It's called Where Responsible AI Meets Reality, Practitioner Perspectives on Enablers for Shifting Organizational Practices. So in order to create human in the loop in our products, we have to shift how we do things at a company level. So what we did was we interviewed 23 people who have jobs similar to mine, who work within organizations or work with companies to create responsible AI solutions. And we asked them, how can their job be better enabled? And three really common things that we saw internally within a company is, number one, diffuse accountability. So the ability to bring in the right people to answer the right problems. Two is clear and transparent processes. And three is success metrics for algorithms and people. So when we create our products, and also when we do employee evaluations, how do we incentivize people to do the right thing? Externally, how do you leverage what's out there, all the great civil society organizations, groups like Partnership on AI, et cetera, who are trying to answer these problems from an external perspective. So how can you leverage those groups to bring in outside opinions, be transparent about systems, ask questions, and know your rights? Next slide, please. And how can you learn more? These are three canonical books. I'm really happy to see that there are more and more books being published every day. These are three of my favorites: Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction, Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Repression, and Virginia Eubank's Automating Inequality. So now to go back to our final multiple choice question, where I asked, again, after my little spiel, should self-driving cars have a steering wheel? We now have 64% of people saying no, and 36% of people saying yes. So I leave you with that statistic. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to questions from the audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rumman, for such a great talk. It's fantastic to hear from you. And I know a lot of people in our audience are really excited about the work that you're doing, and really interested in learning how they can get more involved. So I'll jump right into it, because we've got some questions that have been coming in as your talk has been going on. So the first question here is that so often large corporations are looking for their checklist, right? How can we make sure that our model, our algorithm, our product is quote unquote ethical? But as you've continued to say in your talk here, these ethical implications are ongoing. So how do we create a process? How do we help those people that are really trying to do the right thing? How do we help them create a process for ongoing ethical evaluation?
So that's actually why I created my company, Parity. So the way Parity works is it enables cross-functional collaboration, because you're spot on. Like, what needs to happen is we need to meaningfully incorporate input at different stages of the product development lifecycle. So what should not happen is what I see happen today, where legal and compliance or responsible AI audit happens at the very end of product development, which is literally the worst time it can happen for many reasons. Like, number one, it sets up the relationship to be adversarial. Like, oh God, now the ethical people are coming in to like rain on my parade, right? And number two, it sometimes raises questions that are unanswerable at that stage and could have been answered earlier. So in good faith, most people I ever worked with who built products wanted to make good products. And you're right. I mean, yes, like sometimes people want this checklist. It's not as simple as that. However, we do see critical thinking practices that have become standard in quality assurance. So, for example, in cybersecurity and in software development, you have something called the 12-factor app, which starts with principles and then starts to tell you how to enact those principles. So, what for example, is a 12-factor app for ethics? This is where companies are starting to get to principles, and there are a lot of platforms out there, but Parity is really trying to help do that engagement so that you're doing the critical thinking. The hard part is mapping out your known unknowns and your unknown unknowns, and that's really what we're trying to do with this sort of cross-functional collaboration.
That's awesome. And that's exciting to hear about that work, because I know that certainly we see that a lot in terms of people wanting to work with the School of Data Science, right? And how can you help us understand how to be more ethical? And it's not a one answer question and then we move on. So I think that's really exciting that you're in that work. So sort of related question, and you spoke to this a little bit in your talk, what obligation do we have, an audience here of primarily technologists and data scientists, to actually slow down the pace of technological intervention to make sure that all communities and voices, particularly those that are often underrepresented and not heard, are actually heard in the way that things are deployed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and there's two ways to think about it. So one is that sometimes that's the purpose of things like regulation, and this concept of like slowing down processes. I think it's interesting. So not to fault the person asking it, because that's the common way it's framed. But I do think that there's also a bit of a false dichotomy there too. There are plenty of corners that can be cut. Project development takes as long as it takes because we have prioritized and decided that these things need to happen and those things don't. So no one would say, oh my gosh, let's get this product out faster. Let's not bother to stress test for scalability. Forget it, right? I mean, literally there's no world. However, that is a lengthy and time-consuming process. That isn't necessarily a standard part of product build. So really the goal is how do we put these things into standard practices? Or I was actually talking to somebody this morning who works on responsible innovation. And what I was saying is we actually just need to make our work really boring. And what I mean is it becomes like oh God, now I got to go do that thing. Not in the way that they're dreading it, but it's just like, got to go through my stuff that I got to do to make this product. There shouldn't be anything completely novel or different or unexpected about it, but it should just be a standard part of how we think about things. And again, it's quite difficult to do, and no one's saying it's easy at all. I think we're seeing some good first steps with folks even asking these kinds of questions. I think a few years ago, nobody would have even asked them, or it would have been, kind of a quote unquote fluffy thing to have asked. So it's great that we're starting to think about it. So now the next question is, how do we get that diversity of thought and opinion from all ends into our development process? I suppose if I worked in diversity and inclusion, I would say this is why you need diverse teams. But then also I would add, as a data scientist, how do you incorporate end user or impacted communities input into the design process? And that's really hard to do.
Yeah, great. Absolutely. So what's your take on the human-centered AI movement, such as the Stanford Institute of Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence?
I feel like someone's trolling me here, not in a bad way. Well, I think that one thing I worry very much about, and I'll put on my political science hat for a second. So in political science, you take classes on things like developing democracies. And it's really interesting because people have done so much research on what makes democratic institutions truly democratic, what makes democratic societies long-lived, what makes democracies in countries stable, et cetera. So why am I talking about all this, right? Especially given the current political situation, election, et cetera. But actually it's that, the way we are designing governance of AI systems and who is in the room when we're deciding what human centricity means or what AI governance means, If one were to build a country that way, it is not a country any of us would want to live in, because it would be a fully autocratic country where a bunch of hyper elite people, and I am one of those hyper elites, very often get invited to the same rooms and we ask the same questions of all of our friends and we say, so how should AI be used ethically? Okay, we got this, right? And then we go back to the quote general public and we say, don't worry, we're solving this for you. And it's kind of funny, like ironically funny, because people are now doing research into all of these principles, themes, et cetera, that come up. Algorithm Watch has a repository, about like 150 of them. And, like research into whether or not there are common themes reveals that, yes, there are actually common themes. And I refer to it on our research paper that I alluded to earlier. But part of me is like, of course there's common themes, because it's literally the same 40 people every single time. It's some iteration of it. So one thing I worry about is, these rooms often already are very, very elite people. And again, I am one of those people, right? So I worry very, very much about us falling into the same trap and doing the same things that we like to point fingers at others for doing.
Well, I will tell you that a non-question just came in that said, excellent answer, re the human-centered AI. So I assume that's probably the same person that asked it. And if they're trolling you, they approve of your answer there as well. So
it's got to be someone I know. A text from someone saying, you're right, it was me.
So how does one bring the promise of AI to improve or transform some entrenched institutions without triggering their self-preservation instincts? And the person that's asking says, I've specifically seen in education and healthcare that they have been very timid and conservative compared to what is possible. And so how do we balance that?
What a great, and I love how you've even framed, I love everything about the structure and the framing of your question and your word choice, let me tell you. So I will use a quote that one of my clients once said to me about responsible AI and innovation. And what he said was, we like to cross the street in a pack. So everyone wants to innovate, but they want to all innovate together, right? No one wants to be the outlier of, pushing the envelope too far. Everyone's looking around to see what everybody else is doing. And also similarly, anecdotally, I just got off a call where I was testifying to the New York City Council about the adoption of an algorithmic audit bill. And it was very interesting that when someone brought up that, oh, there's federal law about disparate impact, everyone seemed really, really excited that a law seemed to already exist that seemed to solve their problem, right? And I don't mean that negatively. I think, the city council and the folks who are trying to build this bill really do have best interest at heart, but people are worried about being an overly radical and, sort of overstepping what they perceive to be their bounds. So an answer to your question was what kind of prompted our research in that paper. So what we looked at in that research was not ethical AI initiatives. What we looked at was organizational change dynamics. What are the levers that companies pull in general when trying to institute organizational change? So how does that happen? And back when one day I will write this paper, but I did give a talk last year at Data and Society about theories of change. So specifically thinking through, what are other instances in which we've tried to marry essentially capitalistic incentives with moral imperatives, and how successful have they been, and what was the strategy for doing it? So you look at things like climate change in particular, sustainability, organics, right, as three examples of us trying to merge capitalistic incentives with moral imperatives, and not to get into that whole talk, but it's interesting to see, what sort of incentives they use, what sort of sticks and carrots, and kind of the balance of things, and how relatively successful they all are, depending on your metric and definition of success. So in some cases, what you do is you make the ethical thing the profitable thing, like in organics, for example. In other situations, you may, use heavily used sticks, like vilify people who aren't doing the right thing. That's usually how the climate change movement works. So it's like the small guy versus the big oil company kind of thing, right? So how successful are each of these? What I will say is, and what we do talk about in our paper is, what are the levers of change you can pull? I think the big ones are diffuse accountability and creating the appropriate incentives, and just within your organization. And I'll also tie this to business principle. So one of like the basic startup books that like the canonical startup books is The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. And what he talks about is innovation metrics versus status quo metrics. And what he says, and I thought this is really applicable to responsible AI, is if you're creating something that's truly innovative, of course it fails by traditional metrics, because by definition, innovation is not status quo. So if you are performing well under status quo metrics, you are not innovation. So responsible AI is innovation. This is why we say things like, oh, wow, well, the accuracy dropped. Well, yes, because accuracy is a terrible metric and it doesn't support innovation. So like, it's kind of a long answer to your question, but it's something that I've been noodling on quite a bit too. I'm glad you've asked it.
That's great. That's great to hear your perspective on it. It's great to hear that, those kinds of questions get traction now. I think that that's sort of a new thing, right? And not that long ago, it would have been something that maybe was like, oh, I'd never really thought about that before. So that's exciting. So I know we're right about the end of our time, but I wanted to ask one more question, especially given that, we're at the University of Virginia School of Data Science, a primarily academic audience. And so a great question came in here. And School of Data Science, we're actually really working towards digital humanities initiative, right? And so this kind of relates into that. So within academia, how would you suggest we structure ourselves to put AI in the appropriate perspectives within the humanities?
Wow, what a wonderful question. And I wish we had enough time to like start thinking about it. I mean, oh, wow, what a great question. I think I'll sort of maybe frame it a little bit anecdotally. I was genuinely surprised when I moved to Silicon Valley and everyone framed data science and AI in terms of programming. As a quantitative social scientist, my interest was to tackle sticky problems about people and use data to do that. And programming was just a thing I learned to do it. And it was no different from me learning ethnographic mapping or the survey design. It was just like another way to get the answer. So, like, fundamentally, I think, thinking of this technology as something more than just, the purview of a few advanced academics who do the research on it. Like, sure, I am not an AI researcher as in a computer scientist who's creating new and novel algorithms. But at the same time, there are so many things that we utilize that are considered, that are sort of widespread and diffuse, that you don't have to be a researcher producing cutting edge technology to claim you quote unquote own, right? Like literature professors don't claim to own the English language or, to own literature. All of us can hop in and write whatever terrible short stories that we like to write when we're up at 2 a.m, right? So like, what is the technological equivalence of that? So how do we take this technology and make it something that is a useful tool for folks to use within their profession, if relevant? The other thing is, it is totally fine to not have to use artificial intelligence in your pedagogy or in your fields. I think it is almost sometimes unfortunate that there is so much emphasis placed on STEM. I know it has influenced funding, it has influenced so many things. And I genuinely feel for my colleagues who work in industries that are like, we don't actually need it and it doesn't actually solve major problems for us and we're perfectly fine without it. So I would almost wonder if there's a way to balance the two, to understand the limitations of how this technology can be even useful in teaching, and where it's not useful, and to respect that sometimes it's actually not needed.
I love that. As someone who has built a career in working with data scientists and in data science, but whose background is in music and religious studies, actually, and I got excited about data and the way that it could help me in the kinds of things that I was interested in, and that's really where I found the power of data and data science. So I that answer resonates very well with me in particular. Thank you so much. We are just so excited to have you here and thrilled to have gotten the chance to listen to your talk. And thank you for also taking the time to listen to some questions from our audience as well. We really appreciate, there's a lot going on in the world right now. So thank you for taking the time to hang out with us a little bit here on a Friday afternoon. And
thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.